Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Philosophy Hour of Literary Tales. In this episode, we explore the origins of modernity in Renaissance humanism and their sanctification of the conscience and what it meant and how that legacy developed into modernity. Renaissance humanism laid the foundations for modernity, so much so that critics of modernity also condemn the Renaissance even more so than the Enlightenment, which was, in some ways, a continuation of certain Renaissance ideals. The Renaissance in Europe principally emanated from Catholic clerics and intellectuals who engaged with Islam post-Crusades intellectually rather than violently, and the recovering of classical, mostly Greek texts. Humanism, therefore, emerged through the interfaith and intertextual engagement of the world at that time. Islam on one hand, and Neoplatonic mysticism principally on the other. The core idea of the Renaissance humanists, best exemplified in cleric scholars like Nicholas of Cusa and Marsilio Ficino, was their elimination of the codified notion of religion and their turn to the conscience and its sanctity. Religio, in Latin, means to bind. Dealing with why people would prefer to worship God in its Islamic form rather than the truth of Christianity, and also dealing with how the Greek mystics and philosophers could be truthful in their spiritual and philosophical enunciations without having been Christian, let alone baptized, the humanists argued that the real meaning of religion was the interior heart, or soul, and its impulse to worship transcendence, and the primacy of the self, or conscience, in deciding how to orient itself in this instinctive desire to give gratitude for existence. Ficino goes as far as to say that the Platonic quest for knowledge and the Platonic conception of love prepares the Platonists for knowledge and love of God, thus synthesizing how Platonism can be a bridge to Christianity without the direct encounter with the sacraments of the Church. What united people in religion wasn't monastic vows or ecclesial submission, the traditional view, but the instinct, the desire to worship for the gratitude of existence. This instinct of the heart, or the soul, was inherent to every human being, whether they acknowledged God or not, whether they knew God or not. And as I now use the term religion, it means the interior life and the conscience, since that's what the humanists reinterpreted religion to mean. Drawing on antecedent principles found in the New Testament, principally the book of Acts, when Paul visits Athens, but also Paul's letter to the Romans, and in various patristic fathers, most notably St. Augustine, to a lesser extent St. Justin Martyr, the humanists maintain the reason that Neoplatonic mysticism and even Islam could be compatible with Christianity is because they just needed to hear the truth of the Gospels in order to convert their instinctive impulse to worship the revealed God. Humanists, like Pico Mirandola, argued that other religious traditions all contained the truths of Christianity, and Ficino wrote, of course, his famous work on Platonic theology, synthesizing Christian theology with Platonic mysticism and philosophy. What was needed then was the enlightening of the intellect to achieve this conversion or proper orientation. And it must be said, and it must be known, that conversion in Latin means orientation, what you are directed to. The Neoplatonic mystics and the Muslims all exhibited the truth of religion, the interior desire to worship for the gratitude of being. They were already on the right path, as it were. Now they just needed explication by Christians as to what they were actually seeking to worship, in the case of the Neoplatonists, or what they were missing, in the case of Muslims, the divinity of Christ. What came from this Renaissance belief was the primacy of conscience. The individual, and the individual alone, was responsible for their religious interior life. While the humanists believed the intellect, the conscience, could be persuaded by rational argument and evidence, they rejected the belief in forced conversion and separated religion, again the interior life and conscience, from the state and external forces. One can read, for example, Marsilius of Padua's Defensor Pacis as an early example of the separation of religion, the interior life, and the state, wherein he argued the purpose of the state is to secure peace and order, to permit the interior life of its citizens to flourish. This ideal of the separation of religion and state, which is really the defense of individual conscience against forced external pressure, was subsequently picked up by the Reformers during the Protestant Reformation as integral to their critique of ecclesiastical authoritarianism. The highest maturation of this defense of conscience can be found in John Milton's Areopagitica, and Milton was educated in the humanist tradition at Cambridge, and it also reaches a mature maturation in the nonconformist movements, which relied on arguments of the free conscience for their liberty. For instance, Roger Williams, the famous Puritan theologian and pastor exiled from Massachusetts Bay Colony, wrote in defense of the free conscience when he founded Rhode Island as a haven for all religious dissenters. Men like Luther, Zwingli, and Calvin developed systematic theologies of interiority. While it was, of course, preferable to have Christian civil servants, the civil authority was separate from religious authority, because religious authority is individual. It is pertinent to the interior life of the human being. And while clerics, pastors, bishops, presbyters should try to influence you in a positive way, you and you alone ultimately have the authority to decide for yourself how you are going to live and worship. And the only ultimate religious authority, then, is the individual. Hence Luther's sincerity of the heart and the Reformed doctrine of the priesthood of all believers. While this was often imperfect and messy, even in Reformation lands, the contest between dissenters and civil authorities, especially in England, and the principles of sincerity and religious conscience in Lutheran and Calvinist lands produced the mature view of the free conscience we have inherited and further developed today. By the 19th century, Friedrich Schleiermacher's theology of sincerity was the next continuation of the Renaissance humanistic spirit, insofar as Schleiermacher articulated, true religion was found in the sentiment of the soul and not the liturgies or the sacraments of the churches. Schleiermacher goes as far as to say that the interior feelings and sincerity one has is the gift of the Holy Spirit. At the same time as Schleiermacher was articulating a theology of interior sincerity, late Enlightenment Europe further bifurcated the primacy of conscience to its now recognizable form we have in modernity. From Milton and Locke and other English dissenters, the freedom of conscience was explicitly tied to spiritual matters, because the conscience is an idea born of Christian religion. The late Enlightenment eventually dropped the spiritual origin of the freedom of conscience. This produced the freedom of conscience in our modern, secular, post-spiritual sense. Nevertheless, as all educated and literate people know, this freedom of secular conscience is historically derived from a religious origin in the late Renaissance and its continuation in the nonconformist Protestant tradition. Today's primacy of conscience in all matters, especially ethics, is the current manifestation of the humanist ideal begun in the Renaissance. My body, my choice is now the most manifest example of this ideal divorced from its religious origin. How I choose to live my life, a choice that comes from the interior soul or the conscience, is how we live today. This outgrowth of humanism, therefore, has many manifestations that we see. On the one hand, we can see the emergence of secular humanism as that Enlightenment bifurcation of the conscience from its religious origins, and how it moves into an ethical direction, how we decide to live our lives for ourselves today, and how it is the individual who makes those decisions, much similar to how, when it came to spiritual and religious matters, the individual made those decisions. Religious humanists, being the heirs of the original Renaissance humanist tradition, carry that idea forward in many ways. You have relativists in the religious tradition who say things similar to Jesus is God to me, but maybe not for you. Again, recognizing that all human beings have a religious, spiritual impulse, and I have decided for myself who God is and who to worship. Then you also have the religious compatibilists, much like the actual Renaissance humanists, who assert that all religions and all spiritualities are actually compatible with Christianity. They just need that enlightenment, that wisdom to realize what they are seeking. The world we have today, with its primacy of intellect and conscience, the notion of religion as relating to the interior life, secular and atheistic and agnostic do-it-yourself ethics, as well as the separation of religion and state, or church and state, are all ultimately derivative manifestations of Renaissance humanism. More so than the Enlightenment, although that term is a great propaganda term, the origins of modernity are found in Renaissance humanism, the most important epoch that laid the seeds for our world today. Yet, we are mostly ignorant of the ironies of an originally religious impulse, laying the groundworks for our now mostly secular and individualistic disposition. Our modern beliefs in the primacy of conscience, the separation of religion, the interior life, and the state, the external, the civic, the public life, and the synthetic views of religiosity, even our beliefs in individualist ethics, are all rooted in Renaissance humanism and its elevation and sanctification of the conscience, the interior life, against any and all external forces, be it state, church, or even other human beings. In fact, the root of modern freedom is found in this primacy of the conscience. And without the primacy of the conscience, we cannot have individual liberty.